welcome to Paranormal Pages. Please drop a like or comment if you want to help the channel. Now let's get into the true scary stories. The Last Task. It started innocently enough, a flood of emails that bore the subject line urgent, marked with the all-too-familiar signature of my late boss, Mr. Vincent Radcliffe. He had died 3 weeks ago, and I had sat through his funeral, still unsure if the weight of his absence was a relief or a burden. Working for Radcliffe had been like walking through a minefield, his expectations, his demands, always piling up until you were buried beneath them. The emails, though, came daily, always time-stamped at 3:33 a.m., almost like a bad prank from someone with a twisted sense of humor. At first, I ignored them. I even chuckled at the idea of someone at the office still messing with his old account. But when the emails kept coming, subject lines like "do not ignore" and "you'll regret it," I couldn't help but open one. The contents were nothing but garbled text, strange symbols and half-formed words that sent a shiver down my spine. I chalked it up to a glitch in the system, but something about it felt off. It didn't stop. Every night, more emails, all marked urgent. It was almost as though Radcliffe was still trying to run the office from beyond the grave. "Lena, this is getting ridiculous," I muttered to myself as I sat in front of my computer one night, the blue light illuminating my tired face. I opened yet another email, hoping it would finally give me something I could explain. Instead, my heart skipped a beat. The text read, "Reply now." My fingers hovered over the keyboard, a growing sense of unease settling into my gut. But I did it. I typed, "Who is this? This isn't funny." I hit send. The response came within seconds. It was a single line, "Meet me at the office. There's work to do." I recoiled, pushing my chair back from the desk as if the email itself had a physical presence in the room. The office? Radcliffe's office? The place had been sealed since his death, pending some sort of legal inquiry I wasn't privy to. And why would anyone, if this was a prank, want me to meet them there? I told myself to delete the email, to forget this nonsense, but something tugged at me. It was that same knot in my stomach, the one that Radcliffe used to tie with every condescending glance and every impossible deadline. Against my better judgment, I stood up, grabbed my coat, and headed for the office. The building loomed dark against the moonless night, a cold wind whipping through the parking lot as I approached the glass doors. The security system was supposed to be locked down, but when I scanned my keycard, the door clicked open. My heart pounded. The dim hallway stretched before me, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. I hadn't been here since the day Radcliffe died, and the atmosphere felt wrong, like the building was holding its breath. I hesitated at the door to his office. The frosted glass still bore his name in bold lettering, a constant reminder of the man who had made my life hell. My hand shook as I pushed the door open. The room was exactly how I remembered it, sterile, meticulously organized, the air thick with an unsettling stillness. Except one thing was different. His chair, his high-backed leather chair, was facing away from the desk. And there was someone sitting in it. "Mr. Radcliffe?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The chair began to slowly turn. The chair creaked as it rotated, inch by agonizing inch, revealing the shadowed figure seated behind the desk. My breath caught in my throat when I saw him, Vincent Radcliffe, pale as death, his gaunt face illuminated by the faint light from the street outside. His eyes, once sharp and judgmental, were sunken and clouded, but they were unmistakably his. I took an involuntary step back, my mind screaming that this couldn't be real. "Sit down," he rasped, his voice a ghost of what it used to be, barely more than a breath. I froze. My legs felt like they were made of lead, unwilling to carry me any closer, but something inside me, maybe fear, maybe the same dreadful compulsion that had brought me here, forced me to obey. I sat down across from him, the cold leather of the chair pressing against my back as my eyes stayed fixed on his face. "Do you know why you're here?" he asked, leaning forward slightly. The air in the room seemed to thicken as he moved, like the shadows clung to him. I couldn't respond, my throat had closed up. The only thing I could hear was the pounding of my heart in my ears. Radcliffe's lips curled into a grotesque smile. You always were good at following orders. I need you to complete a task for me." "A task?" I croaked, finally finding my voice, though it was weak and shaky. I could feel the weight of his stare, and I couldn't look away. His dead eyes bored into mine, and despite the terror crawling under my skin, some twisted part of me felt the same old dread that came with being in his presence. He nodded, his movements slow, deliberate. "There's a file. A very important one. It's unfinished business. I left instructions for you, Lena. You'll find them in the basement." The basement? Of course. It was the one place in the building I'd never been, a part of the office that Radcliffe had always kept locked. No one ever questioned what was down there. It was his domain, a secret corner of the building that only he and a few select people ever entered. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry as sandpaper. Why me? Why not someone else? The question slipped out before I could stop myself, my fear pushing me to demand some kind of explanation. Radcliffe's smile faded, replaced by a grim, almost disappointed look. "Because you owe me, Lena," he whispered, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "I made you. I can unmake you. You're not free yet." My stomach churned, nausea rising up as the weight of his words sank in. He was right, of course. Despite the horror of his death and the relief I had felt when he was finally gone, some part of me had always known that the chains he'd placed around me were still there, invisible but inescapable. "You'll find the key in the drawer," he added, his voice a low hiss. I watched as his hand moved slowly, pointing toward the desk drawer. My hands trembled as I reached for it, my mind racing with dread. What could possibly be in the basement? What kind of unfinished business did a dead man have? The drawer slid open with a heavy thud, and inside was a single, rusted key. It was old, far too old for the office building's modern locks. I hesitated, feeling the weight of the cold metal in my palm. Radcliffe's voice, cold and commanding, shattered the silence. "Don't keep me waiting." I stood up, feeling my legs wobble beneath me. The office seemed to close in as I backed toward the door. His pale face never left mine, even as I stumbled out, the key clutched tightly in my hand. The hallway outside was pitch dark, and the distant hum of the building's power felt muffled, distant, like the place had been swallowed by something far older and darker than the man I had known. I stared down the hall toward the elevator that would take me to the basement, feeling a growing sense of dread settle over me like a second skin. Whatever was down there, it wasn't just a file. I knew that now. But I also knew I had no choice. I stepped into the elevator, the metallic hum of the doors sliding shut echoing through the empty building. The rusted key was cold in my hand, its edges digging into my palm as I pressed the button marked B. The elevator descended slowly, the sensation in my stomach growing heavier with each passing second. My mind kept circling back to Radcliffe's pale, hollow face, the unnatural calm in his voice, the weight of his words. What could possibly be waiting for me down in the basement? A shudder ran through me as the elevator came to a stop. The doors opened with a dull groan, revealing a narrow hallway lit by flickering fluorescent lights. The basement was nothing like the rest of the office. It was damp, claustrophobic, and smelled faintly of mold. The walls were lined with file cabinets, most of them ancient, rusted, and overflowing with paper. I glanced down at the key in my hand, wondering what it could possibly unlock in a place like this. I walked down the hallway, the sound of my footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust on the floor. At the far end, a single door stood, its surface marred with scratches and dents. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached it. The key felt heavier in my hand, like it was drawing me towards something I wasn't ready to face. The air around the door was cold, unnaturally cold, colder than anywhere else in the basement. I fumbled with the lock, my hand shaking. The key slid in with a quiet click, and the door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. Inside, I saw a single table with a thick leather-bound book resting on top. My breath caught in my throat. There was something about that book, its ancient, cracked cover, the way it seemed to absorb the light, that made my skin crawl. I hesitated at the doorway, my instincts screaming at me to turn back. But then I heard it. Radcliffe's voice, soft and insistent, echoing in my mind, "You owe me." The compulsion to follow through was overwhelming. I stepped into the room, the air growing colder with every step. As I reached the table, I could see the book more clearly. Its pages were yellowed with age, filled with strange symbols, just like the ones in the emails I had received. I reached out to touch it, my fingers hovering over the cover. The moment I made contact, the room seemed to shift, like the air itself was alive, swirling around me. The lights flickered, and the shadows in the corners of the room deepened. Suddenly, I heard a low, guttural whisper. It was coming from the book itself, the pages rustling as if something inside was moving. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. But before I could react, the door behind me slammed shut with a deafening bang, plunging the room into near darkness. Panic set in. I rushed to the door, pulling at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The cold air in the room seemed to thicken, wrapping around me like invisible hands. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. I turned back to the book, its pages flipping open on their own, revealing a page filled with symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I could see images in the symbols, figures, shadowy and twisted, crawling out of the pages. I didn't know what they were, but I knew they were coming for me. Desperation clawed at my mind as I backed away from the book, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The whispering had become a cacophony of voices now, swirling around the room, growing louder and louder. And then, I saw it. Emerging from the shadows at the far end of the room, something impossibly tall, its eyes gleaming in the darkness. It wasn't Radcliffe. It was something far worse. I froze, paralyzed as the figure emerged fully from the shadows. It was tall, unnaturally so, its limbs long and thin, like twisted branches. Its face, if you could call it that, was a void, hollow and eyeless, save for two faint points of light where eyes should have been. The air around it seemed to hum, vibrating with a malevolent energy that made my skin crawl. I backed into the wall, my breath shallow, unable to tear my eyes away from the thing that had entered the room. As it moved closer, the whispering in the air turned into a low, guttural growl. My mind raced, desperate to make sense of the situation. Was this what Radcliffe had left behind? Was this his unfinished business? The room seemed to constrict around me, the cold air pressing down on my chest like an invisible weight. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. Then it spoke. Not in words, but in thoughts that invaded my mind like a sickness. Finish the task. Complete the contract. My knees buckled under the weight of its command. I didn't understand. What task? What contract? My eyes darted back to the book on the table, its pages still glowing with those strange symbols. And then it hit me, Radcliffe had summoned this thing, hadn't he? That's why he needed me here. To finish what he had started. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. What do you want? I forced the words out, my voice barely a whisper. The creature didn't answer with words, but the images that flashed in my mind were enough. It wanted me to open the book, to read the incantation etched on those ancient, cursed pages. My stomach turned at the thought. I had no idea what kind of power I'd be unleashing, but I knew it couldn't be anything good. Yet, Radcliffe's voice echoed in my mind, commanding me from beyond the grave, "You owe me." I couldn't think straight. My head throbbed, and the shadows in the room seemed to close in on me. Slowly, as if in a trance, I reached for the book again. My fingers brushed the pages, and a sudden jolt of energy surged through me, sending shivers down my spine. The creature behind me loomed closer, its presence suffocating. The symbols on the page seemed to pulse, demanding to be read. "Do it," the voice inside my head urged. I took a deep breath and began to speak, the words foreign, twisted, and sharp in my mouth. As I recited the incantation, the air in the room grew heavier, darker, and the walls seemed to tremble. The ground beneath my feet quaked as if the very earth was protesting what I was about to unleash. But I couldn't stop. The power of the words surged through me, controlling me, forcing me to continue. Suddenly, a violent wind whipped through the room, howling like a chorus of the damned. The book's pages flew open, and the symbols blazed with an eerie, otherworldly light. The creature behind me growled in approval, its eyeless face mere inches from my own now, feeding off my fear. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last, until the final word of the incantation left my lips. The room went still. For a moment, nothing happened. I stood there, trembling, waiting for some unspeakable horror to descend upon me. Then, the creature's presence shifted. Its eyes, those glowing points of light, flickered, and I felt something change. The air was no longer cold, no longer oppressive. But the sense of dread lingered, stronger than before. Radcliffe's voice cut through the silence once more. "Well done, Lena. The task is complete." I turned, heart in my throat, expecting to see him standing there, alive again. But no. The creature remained, and as I watched, its form began to shift, morphing into something that vaguely resembled him. It was as though Radcliffe had been using this creature all along, a puppet to his twisted will, even in death. Before I could fully grasp what was happening, the creature, now fully transformed into Radcliffe's likeness, smiled at me. "You freed me," it said, its voice low and full of malice. "Now you'll take my place." My blood ran cold. The weight of what I had done crashed over me. I had just finished the task Radcliffe had started, but in doing so, I had sealed my own fate. The shadows in the room grew longer, closing in on me, and the last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me whole was the twisted grin on Radcliffe's face as he disappeared, leaving me alone in the cold, silent void. Hey! Subscribe for more true scary stories. Story 2. The Last Flash. I've always been drawn to strange things, the kind of objects that hold history in their very materials, old clocks, creaky furniture, dusty books. That's what led me to the flea market last Saturday. Wandering through rows of discarded relics, I stumbled upon something unusual, something I couldn't resist, an antique camera, its black leather casing worn and the brass lens frame tarnished. The vendor, an elderly man with sunken eyes and skin like wax paper, smiled crookedly as I picked it up. "That one's a relic," he rasped, his voice like gravel shifting in the wind. "Older than it looks. If you're into strange histories, well, this one's got a story." His words intrigued me, but I brushed it off as a sales pitch. Still, there was something about the camera, something heavy in the air around it, almost like a pulse. I held it, feeling the weight of time in my hands, and without thinking much of it, I bought it. The man's smile widened as I walked away, and I remember distinctly that he didn't say goodbye. When I got home, I placed the camera on the table and studied it more closely. The model was unfamiliar, though I knew a little about photography. There were no markings I could identify, nothing to give away its origins except for the faint etching on the back, Spectral, a brand I'd never heard of. Shrugging, I aimed the camera out my window and pressed the button. The click of the shutter felt oddly final, like a door closing. Out of curiosity, I developed the picture in a makeshift darkroom I had in my basement, not expecting much. But when the image came into view, something was wrong. The street I'd photographed was there, but it was off. It looked older, like the clock had been wound back a century. And there, in the middle of the road, was a man, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, lying face down, his limbs twisted unnaturally. His eyes stared blankly into nothing. My heart pounded as I stared at the photo. The street outside had been empty when I took the shot. There was no man, no accident, just the quiet hum of the modern world. Yet here he was, frozen in time, his death etched into the image. I should have stopped there, but I didn't. I was fascinated. I wanted to know more. I needed to understand what the camera was showing me. And then, I made the worst mistake of my life. I turned the camera around and snapped a selfie. After I took the selfie, the camera felt cold in my hands, unnaturally so, like it had been submerged in ice water. My skin tingled, the hairs on my neck standing up as I quickly set it down. It wasn't until an hour later, standing over the developing tray in my darkroom, that I realized something was terribly wrong. As the chemicals worked their magic and the photo began to take shape, my heart stopped. At first, it was just my face, nothing out of the ordinary. But as the image sharpened, I saw more. My skin, my neck, both were covered in deep, angry bruises, and my eyes bulged unnaturally wide, like I was suffocating. My mouth was open in a silent scream, veins popping from my forehead as if I had died in the moment the picture was taken. I staggered back, knocking over a jar of developing fluid. The photo was still dripping wet, but the details were undeniable. I didn't understand. How could this be? I was fine. My pulse was racing, but I was alive, wasn't I? I stared into the black and white horror of my own face, twisted in some terrible death throes. That night, I barely slept. I could hear every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind. The picture haunted me from the kitchen table where I had left it. In the darkness, I swore I saw my reflection in the window, only it wasn't me. It was the same version of me from the photograph, eyes wide, gasping for air, struggling. Each time I turned on the lights, there was nothing there, just my tired, trembling reflection. By morning, I was on the verge of panic. I needed answers. My mind kept going back to the man who sold me the camera, the one who smiled like he knew something I didn't. Desperation pushed me back to the flea market. When I arrived, the rows of vendors were all there, but the man was gone, his booth completely empty. I asked around, but no one seemed to remember him. It was as though he had vanished into thin air. It wasn't until I found an older vendor, a woman with wild white hair, that I got some clarity, though it wasn't the kind I wanted. "The spectral, you say," she whispered, eyes narrowing at the mention of the name. "That camera's cursed. Anyone who uses it sees death, either what has been or what's about to happen. It shows the final moments of whoever it photographs." I felt the blood drain from my face. "But I took a photo of myself," I said, voice barely above a whisper. "It showed me, dead." Her eyes turned cold, and she leaned in, her breath sour and close. "Then your time is near, boy. The camera don't lie. It never has." She straightened, looking past me as if I were already a ghost. "You'd best prepare yourself. Once it shows you your death, there's no going back." Fear settled deep in my bones as her words echoed in my head. I left the market in a daze, the world around me blurry and distant. I couldn't stop thinking about the photo, the grotesque image of my strangled body. But the most chilling realization hadn't hit me yet. I was seeing my future. And whatever killed me was coming. By the time I got home, the house felt wrong. It was as though every shadow had deepened, every corner darker, and the air was thick with something I couldn't describe. I stood at the front door for a long moment, not wanting to go inside, but knowing I couldn't stay outside either. My hand hesitated on the knob, trembling with the growing weight of dread. Inside, the camera still sat on the table, untouched, but it felt alive, like it was watching me. The photograph of my suffocating face stared up at me, and I couldn't stand it anymore. I grabbed the picture, crumpled it, and threw it into the trash, but it didn't make me feel any better. The image was burned into my memory now. No matter what I did, I couldn't forget those bulging eyes, the bruises, the panic frozen on my face. I poured myself a drink, hoping to numb my nerves. But the house was filled with sounds I couldn't explain. Creaking floorboards, soft whispers in the walls. It was as if the entire place had become a living entity, breathing in sync with the fear coursing through my veins. I checked the windows, bolted the doors, but I knew it was pointless. Whatever was coming for me wasn't going to be stopped by locks. I sat on the couch, gripping my glass, and my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from Mark, a friend of mine. He had no idea what was happening, of course. "Hey man, haven't heard from you in a while. You okay?" The normalcy of his message felt almost mocking. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, trying to type out a reply. I wanted to tell him everything, but how could I? Who would believe me? Suddenly, a chill swept through the room, and I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate. My heart slammed in my chest as I turned, but no one was there. The camera, though, had shifted slightly, pointing toward me again, its cold lens gleaming in the dim light. I hadn't touched it. Swallowing hard, I picked it up, feeling the weight of it, as if it were judging me. The smooth metal was icy against my skin, and I had to suppress a shudder. I don't know what compelled me to do it. Maybe it was defiance, maybe desperation, but I found myself speaking aloud. "What do you want from me?" My voice cracked, breaking the thick silence. The camera, of course, didn't answer. But the temperature in the room plummeted, and the soft click of the shutter echoed through the air, even though I hadn't pressed the button. Something snapped inside me. This thing, whatever it was playing with me. My fear had become its fuel. And I realized that what I had captured in that photograph wasn't just a reflection of my death, it was the thing that would kill me. It was here, somewhere, lurking in the shadows, waiting to make the image a reality. I sat frozen, the camera heavy in my hands, waiting for the next sound, the next sign that someone, was in the house with me. My breaths were shallow, each one a struggle, as if the very air had thickened, pressing against my lungs. The soft click of the shutter echoed in my mind, replaying over and over, like the ticking of a clock counting down my final moments. Then, I heard it again. A faint whisper, my name, spoken in a voice so cold and familiar that it sent a shiver through my entire body. I jerked my head towards the hallway. The shadows there were shifting, moving with a life of their own, deepening into something darker than darkness. I stood, unable to stop myself, and walked toward them as if drawn by an invisible force. The hallway stretched longer than it should have, warping and twisting as I moved forward. My hands trembled as I gripped the camera tighter, using it like a shield even though I knew it was the source of my doom. The shadows gathered at the end of the hall, forming into something vaguely human. Its outline flickered in and out of existence, just a silhouette, but unmistakable, me. Or at least, what was left of me. It was the version of myself from the photograph, the twisted, suffocating corpse that I had seen only hours before. My breath caught in my throat as the figure stepped forward, the bruises on its neck dark and bloated, its eyes wide and unblinking. It raised its hand, reaching out to me, and I felt my throat tighten as though invisible fingers were closing around it. I gasped for air, my vision blurring as panic overtook me. The pressure on my neck increased, and I stumbled back, dropping the camera. My hand instinctively went to my throat, trying to pull away the invisible force strangling me. I was choking, just like in the picture, my own reflection staring back at me in silent, horrified recognition. The thing that wore my face smiled, a grotesque, unnatural grin that split its bruised lips wide. I hit the floor, gasping, my vision swimming. My chest heaved as I tried to breathe, but the grip around my throat only tightened. My eyes flicked to the camera lying a few feet away, its lens staring at me like a predator watching its prey. In my final moments, I knew what I had to do. Summoning the last of my strength, I reached for the camera, my fingers brushing against the cold metal. The shadow version of myself loomed over me, its hand still outstretched, but I managed to wrap my hand around the camera and pull it towards me. With trembling hands, I aimed it at the figure and pressed the shutter. The flash exploded in the dark hallway, filling the space with blinding light. For a brief moment, everything stopped. The pressure on my throat vanished, and the shadow figure froze, its grotesque smile faltering. And then, just like that, it was gone, dispersed into the air like smoke, leaving only silence behind. I collapsed on the floor, coughing, my body shaking with terror and exhaustion. The camera, now lifeless, lay beside me. Slowly, I pushed myself up and crawled toward it, dreading what I would see. I pulled the new photograph from the slot and held it up with trembling hands. My breath caught in my throat once again. There, staring back at me, was nothing. I was alone. The shadow of death had retreated, for now. But as I held the camera, the weight of it in my hands still cold and unnatural, I knew this wasn't over. The camera had shown me my death, but it hadn't happened yet. The future could be delayed, but it couldn't be stopped. And I realized then, as I sat in the silence of my house, that the final flash would come. It was only a matter of time. The end. Subscribe for more true scary stories. Thanks for watching.